We're here in San Francisco, California at the HQ of Impulse Labs with CEO, founder Sam D'Amico. Thank you for having me in the middle of your lab.
Awesome. Yeah, no, and this is, you caught us early enough that, we have, people are just starting to filter in. So this is, we can actually just be super disruptive in the middle of the lab, which is awesome.
Yes. So we filmed the episode a few weeks ago, which was awesome. And you guys were just at CES. Really quick, what was kind of the reaction like? This is the first kind of public unveil of the system, right?
Yeah, so we basically put a stake in the ground saying, hey, we're making appliances with batteries. Stove's gonna probably look like this, that sort of thing. I showed some videos showing hey, we're 10 times faster than my gas stove at boiling water. We showed all that sort of stuff. We didn't really say this is the detailed spec sheet of the product. By the way, you can pre-order on this link. We had to kind of put out a lot more information to kind of get to that level, and CES is a great opportunity and substrate to do that.
Awesome. Well, so it went well overall. You're happy with
that? Yeah. So it's like the inbound we got from just other appliance brands kind of circling around and checking us out. It's in some sense, it's by adding a battery and by also doing a couple other things, including the temperature sensing and the higher performance, this is kind of the first new thing in the space in years, maybe decades is basically probably the right way to say it.
So in the episode, we talk a lot about the company and the vision and the current approach to things. But what was your personal background into founding Impulse?
Yeah, so the story here, let's go back I think it's 15 years ago at this point. Man, I'm old. I was on the solar car team at Stanford. Honestly, that was kind of the beginning of the electric vehicle revolution. Started partially in universities. The beginnings of Tesla were a number of the earliest employees, including the founding CTO and a couple other folks, were Stanford Solar Car members. And part of the constraints of that program was you build a single seat carbon fiber solar electric vehicle and you drive it across Australia from north to south as fast as you possibly can within some constraints of the rules. And then you promptly, you compete against a worldwide array of teams, and usually lose to a Dutch one because they're quite good most of the time. More lately, it's been the Belgians. So
this is an ongoing thing.
It's an ongoing thing, and this is actually the biggest recruiting funnel for Tesla and SpaceX in terms of kind of new grads who have talent. And it's not just solar car too. It's Formula SAE, it's Formula Electric. There's a bunch of these other programs now. And so basically, student project teams are amazing in terms of kind of getting people into this space. What I ended up doing was, ironically, battery pack firmware. So I got to kind of really dive into the details of lithium-ion battery packs circa, let's call it 2010, 2011, on all that sort of stuff. Promptly, I then got sucked into a very different industry, which everyone's talking about this week, given the Vision Pro release, which is the AR/VR one. I started on the Google Glass team as an intern, and then ended up jumping between Google and Oculus a couple times, working on a bunch of different headsets.
What led you to that, and what was that experience like?
So I think the correct term is nerd sniping. Basically, I for the solar car team, I built a heads-up display system for the driver, which was a little bit extraneous. And the idea was that included the rear view camera and a couple other things like that. So I built all that, and that was a pretty good pitch to be an intern on the Glass team, which I had no idea that was actually going on. So basically my friend was I referred you to this group. It is a good fit. I can't explain what it is. And then the next summer I was working on Google Glass, hilariously.
So obviously the stove is incredible itself. It boils water, I think, hot take, faster than what you guys say. I know scientifically.
It is faster than what we say.
Oh, okay. I think it's incredible. But there's a secret plan here beyond making one of the world's best stove. Can you talk more about your secret master plan?
So it's not, the secret master plan thing is a funny thing to say with that exact vocab, but I think it's actually very intentional. It's you build super high-end appliances to start, you make them affordable as you kind of get scale, obviously. So this is not going to be an inaccessible, unobtainium thing, even at day zero, because it's we're already basically selling the thing at the same prices as Thermador, Viking, Gaggenau, those sort of premium brands. But then there's now all these really generous federal subsidies in place. So it's after you take those out, now you're more in Samsung, LG, Bosch sort of territory, which is much more accessible and reasonable. But the point is build the highest end appliances with the highest performance possible. We're about 3x more performant than induction stoves, about 5x more performant than gas stoves in terms of like a boiling water benchmark. And then from the temperature control side, like this is something that no one else really has at this form factor. And like even among other products that have this capability, we're substantially higher performance and able to use it at the higher powers, which no one else really can. So get in the door with a super high-end, high-performance product that is like going to get people to switch. And then there's a battery in it. And the battery, one, enables that high performance, but also is a home battery. And so if you look at the number of homes that are in America, it's, let's say like 140 million homes, about 10% are getting remodeled or like replacing an appliance in a given year. So like there's maybe a 14 million home like opportunity turnover. If you can fit 10 kilowatt hours of lithium iron phosphate batteries into each of those homes when those upgrades happen, you're putting 140 gigawatt hours onto the grid, which is substantial. I think the total amount of storage in the grid, there's a bunch of different estimates on this, but it's like, that's somewhere in the 2 to 3x of like the total amount of energy storage in the grid that you could do every year just by making the next generation of appliances come with like medium-sized batteries.
So this is incredibly interesting to me, like from two angles. The first being, I'd like to hear more about like how you went from working on kind of headset display and stuff in that tech to consumer tech, but very more, different appliances and things. And also like, when was that master plan always a part of it from the earliest stages? How did that transition interweave with this idea?
Yeah. So I started actually, my background was like, let's call it like software, firmware, embedded engineering. I did some PCB design, but not a lot. I was like much more on the software side than on the hardware side. If you think of me as an electrical engineer, it's kind of more of like what, like an electrical engineer that did software engineering is kind of like, if you think of my like original background. The transition point was when I joined Google, they actually put me on a team that was doing the camera hardware, which is really weird and a left turn. So it was like, and for reference, that involved some electrical engineering, but not a ton. But a lot of like quality engineering, learning to work through the supply chain, learning to do design stuff with partners, a little bit of software, but mostly when it came to test. And so I got all the experience on like the other half of the hardware engineering world that you don't get to normally do in school. And that's like, okay, now I'm going to meet with vendors at CES and they're going to pitch us on being the alternate supplier for the camera module for Google Glass. Like, it's like taking meetings like that versus like, okay, you're going to sit down and design a printed circuit board. And that was definitely a plot twist, but it was actually really, really, really valuable in giving me the skills that you wouldn't otherwise have to like be able to build out a supply chain for a company like this, like 10 years later.
So, but can you talk more specifically about kind of the pizza kind of story? And
Yeah.
And also, when did the realization that like, oh my gosh, we could like secretly, or very quietly, I should say, reimagine America's like power grid?
So those are almost two questions, and I want to make sure that
Right.
like so
Okay, so I didn't know if they were related, so let's separate them then. Talk to me about the pizza story then.
the pizza story. So I was working on the haptics for what became the Quest Pro controllers for Meta, company formerly known as Facebook. And what ended up happening there was we went to a haptics conference in Japan. We went to some pizza shop called Savoy, which is incredible. And I got my pizza out of this oven in like 30 seconds or something like that. Maybe 30, 45 seconds. We can debate that. This then caused me to get kind of obsessive. Maybe this is the Italian heritage in me. I'm not exactly sure. I was like, I want to cook pizza really fast and I want to do it with like a tabletop device. And realized this was a fundamentally power limited exercise. It's like, you want to just put as much infrared light and like heat from the bottom, but also infrared light from the top onto your pizza to essentially make it as fast as possible. And people talk about like, oh, you want a 900 degree oven and all these other things like that. It's really an infrared light and situation and how much power you can get onto the pizza. Realized that the best way to do that with a plug-in device was to put a battery in the device, because that would let you boost the power well beyond what the wall plug would be able to do. And this was at the time where like we were now in the back half of the 2010s. This was like 2019 timeframe when battery prices were getting cheap enough that it was like you could actually make a consumer device that was priced in the same range as some of these like premium like smart oven products, and have a very differentiated feature set than what was already on the market with those companies. because everyone was kind of focused on how can you add smart features, connectivity, meal kits, AI, et cetera. And I was like, but that was all a reaction to the fact that there was no performance upgrade possible to these devices. You were limited by the 120 volt plug. And I've heard through the grapevine that like a couple of these companies have been like, oh man, if we had more power, we could really do cook amazing pizza. Like I've gotten explicit things being like, we actually prototyped this, didn't make the jump to putting a battery in it. And so once I realized that, it was like, okay, game on, this is a way to make a killer product. Now, the second realization was I do a bunch of venture investing, Astranis included. And I kind of had an idea in the back of my head of like what would actually work in the venture capital ecosystem, and realized that doing a singular product bet is not the right way to go here. And like, it's like, yes, we can make a cool singular device, but you almost need to have either a portfolio device strategy, or you need a portfolio of a devices strategy, or you need a platform strategy. And then I was like, okay, how big is this battery? And then kind of looked at different appliances and realized that, okay, if you pivot from maybe a tabletop pizza oven to, let's say, a stove, the battery is a couple kilowatt hours, which is useful enough to basically help mitigate peak home loads. And then you're like, okay, that's the beginning of this new idea, which is let's put small batteries at the very edge of the grid inside these very high peak load appliances. You mitigate their peak loads so the appliances draw less power. It means that you need less wiring requirements to like put electric appliances at the edge of the grid to begin with. And then you're also adding essentially a peaker power plant right at the edge of the grid in a diffuse way, decentralized across every home in America.
As far as master plans go that I've been lucky enough to hear, like this has got to be one of my favorites, because I like it's just so, I don't know, it's one of those ideas that you're like, why didn't I think of that before? Once you hear it, and like you said, I love that focus on it's enough to be useful. It's not this super expensive kind of like battery only thing. So another question I have is like kind of getting more into the lane of like founder and startup advice. I often wonder and think a lot about where founders get their ideas and their initial origins for companies. And I love that yours is essentially from like, you have this like hard engineering and software mind, and then you also are curious. How do I make pizza fast? Can you talk to me about like, I don't know, are there other examples of this, of founders who had kind of curiosity driven story that led them to founding, or just in general, like what you think is good advice for how do you follow curiosity? Do you follow a problem you're excited about?
I think a good checkpoint is, have you annoyed your friends about this idea enough? And I definitely did. And because if people were like, are you still working on that pizza oven idea? And I'm just like, and this kept happening through the pandemic. And then it's like, and I even had a deck ready to go with pretty much the full impulse pitch and story, like end of 2019, which I can share with you at some point, but it will need to be expunged from the internet. So it's like if the threshold I think is, are you annoying your friends enough about this? And like, because if it sticks in your head and you're not being dissuaded, even if you're talking to like, and I think this like San Francisco is an amazing place for people who are positive about startup ideas. But if you talk to highly technical people about stuff like this, they will poke holes in everything. And if you can survive the Thunderdome of that and keep annoying your friends about it, maybe you should go consider doing that idea.
What's one of the most interesting technical problems you guys have solved, and how did you engineer out of it?
Yeah, so let me think of, there's a couple different things. So I would say the first one is definitely the temperature sensing. And we're going to share more on kind of like the details of that later this year, but I kind of want to just at the very high level, we wanted to triple the power of an induction stove versus what was currently possible. And when you look at how induction stoves normally work, and in the background here, you can maybe even make out blurrily just like a bunch of torn down induction stoves, because we've torn down a gazillion stoves. They usually sense behind the glass. They have a thermistor behind the glass to kind of make sure that nothing gets too hot. But because it takes a long time for the heat to propagate through the glass, you end up with a situation where the pan could be glowing red hot, and that sensor on the backside of the glass wouldn't see it yet until it's too late, basically. And so if you go and just triple the output power of a stove, you're going to run into this problem very quickly of like, well, this is great for boiling water, but like what happens when you put a dry pan on there? What happens when you put, you're just stir frying and like the remaining water boils off? And so you have to actually innovate on the temperature sensing side. And we basically had to like boil the ocean figuratively to find a solution that actually worked fast enough and reliably enough and like high performance enough to enable our performance capability. And we landed that, but it took quite a long time and us studying literally every way to possibly do it before we figured out an approach that worked.
What are some technologies or research that are maybe emerging in the next 5 to 10 years that have you the most excited?
So there's definitely the like sodium ion battery stuff that's starting to happen. There's also just like production changes that are happening with like currently all LFP battery cells are built in China. A number of actually Chinese firms are starting to onshore that to the United States as well because of the IRA incentives. So there's also a bunch of supply chain changes that are potentially coming down the pipe in the next couple of years, downstream of the Inflation Reduction Act. So that there's definitely, that's the changes in the battery side. We also looked at like, because we're doing super high power electronics, there's a bunch of changes in like transistor technology. So like silicon carbide, gallium nitride, et cetera. We've luckily been able to evade having to use them through kind of clever engineering. So from a cost perspective, but we're now going to get to the point of like your power brick is getting way smaller and is still like tens of watts. It's like stuff like that is enabled by a lot of these transformations that have kind of been happening quietly behind the scenes over the last several years. And it's like the advances in power electronics are in some sense underappreciated by the masses, but it's like very much enabling of this kind of latest wave of deep tech startups.
You mentioned supply chain. I think you're, out of some of the people I know, probably have one of the most realistic and smart takes on supply chain. Can you kind of talk a little bit about your theory there for founders and building with a good supply chain?
Yeah, so I think that let's start from first principles, which is like if you were going to build a hardware startup, think about how much volume you need to be successful, right? So like if you're SpaceX and you're building Falcon 9 for the first time, it's 10 units. You might need to build your own factory. Also, you're probably welding aluminum rings. In the Falcon 9 case, you're welding aluminum rings of a certain size. You're going to need to build to get that tooling. It's not some off-the-shelf thing. So I think a lot of people slot themselves into that as a template when what you should be looking at is something more like Starlink, which is very high volume production. And then it's like, okay, then you look at what is the lookalike to my product and try to figure out if you can buy versus build, at least on the factory side. And I think it's really important to realize that like building a factory is just as hard as designing a awesome product. And so if you can work with partners that have already got that brought up, you are massively advantaged in terms of time to market and also just like risk mitigating things that you may not be an expert at, even if you think you know what you know, but like you may not know the whole picture, for instance. So it's kind of our goal, and the way we operate is trying to make sure that like we sequence a couple things, we sequence everything. We don't try to do stuff in parallel. So it's like build the product, bring it up with external manufacturing partners, and then onshoring and other tasks. Like let's say you want to run your own facility for certain programs or whatever. Don't try to put that at the same time as bringing your first product to market.
What is some advice you have for making great relationships with your manufacturing partners?
I think I was telling someone this is like a hot pot and buy show thing, but it depends on basically what you have to do is you have to be willing to go fly out is the situation. And then I think there's also you also have to make sure that there's an incentive alignment where it's like people are genuinely excited about entering a new sector and seeing you as a way to kind of prove that out. And it's almost a pitch narrative. It's not the same as pitching to VCs, but in some sense, it's like they are spending opportunity cost on you, even though you're paying them. And understanding that and how to kind of like navigate some of the cultural norms and respect on that side is like super important.
What's been one of the biggest things you've learned since founding Impulse?
I think there's like, I mean, I'll be very blunt. It's like, this is the first time I've actually managed a ton of people. And so I think there's a lot of cases just around like scaling up yourself as a manager. And you think like, hey, I've like figured out how to deal with 10 people. And then it's like, well, 20 is different. And so there's kind of a continuous learning process here where it's like making sure that I stay humble and try to like up level myself, including in front of my team, and taking feedback like actively as part of that. Because I mean, there's kind of this is one of those things where it's like second time founders, sometimes there's a pluses or minuses or whatever. It's like, but one of the advantages of being first time founder is like you can absorb more and listen more and in some sense iterate your methods. Add feedback from your team, basically.
What do you think most hardware startups or hard tech startups kind of get wrong?
I think the big one, so there's a couple things. One is, so people say hardware is hard. People say, I think that's probably the right quote. But what's interesting is like, it's like, if you under leverage the things that already exist and you do too much in-house, you can doom yourself. But you have to be very careful with that. It's kind of this mix of like, you have to understand which parts of the supply chain are actually good and mature and which parts are not. And I think like and then if you go look at other startups, this is not necessarily what you should not copy verbatim what other startups are doing. And I think like SpaceX's resounding success in vertically integrating huge chunks of their manufacturing is indicative actually more of a supply chain that wasn't ready for what they wanted to build than it is on you should just vertically integrate everything because you can't trust the external suppliers, for instance. And so part of this was like understanding that like the overseas supply chain will let you build a super high quality product super affordably, and there's really talented hardware engineers that can work on your program at a moment's notice if you get some of those folks on board. That's a big deal. It's high friction to get that across because like there's language barriers, there's all these other things. But it's important to realize that like one, there's not one size fits all. You should not copy verbatim what other people say, but make sure you find out what your points of leverage are and don't duplicate stuff that you can buy.
What's something that you wish more people asked you about with Impulse?
So I think this is something that I think the strength of our supply chain relationships is underappreciated. And we'll probably share more about the specifics of that later this year, but it's something where it's like, I take a lot of pride in how we got that off the ground. I actually think there's a lot of mutual respect between the various teams that we work with. And this is something where it feels much more like we are a tier one company like Meta working with our partners than it's like we're this scrappy startup that's still in a warehouse in Dogpatch.
Can you try to describe the way you think? And what I mean by that is like, whenever you kind of encounter a problem, what are some of your brain's knee-jerk reactions to it, or what are some of the lenses you commonly find yourself looking at the world through?
So I think the one thing I do that's just like I've told people like, how do you know all this information? What do you do to do this? And it's like, if I hear something I've not heard about before, or I'm uncertain about something, I will literally go pull up Google and search for it, usually ending up on Wikipedia. But I think there's the strategy of just like making sure that when something enters my head, it doesn't exit. It gets kind of like stopped. I will then look up the details, and then it's like I'll have more context as well. And I've been just continuously doing that for years, basically. So I think that's one piece, which is just like how to basically absorb information and learn it. Is like it's that. The second thing is learning from kind of like what successful organizations have done, which is like, I would say Tesla and SpaceX have been successful here, which with being able to take ideas, hardware solutions, et cetera, outside of kind of the ivory tower of aerospace or automotive and pulling them into those places, because like consumer electronics has advanced massively over the past 10 to 20 years. And it's not just like, it's not just the, like the capability. It's not just like the devices capability. It's like the manufacturing methods. It's like what the supply chain is able to do. All of those things have gotten way more mature. And it's at the point where it's like, there's actually just a disruption opportunity in like building stoves like consumer electronics, ignoring the battery, ignoring any of the other engineering advances we put into the system. But it's like, in some sense, that lesson is a really big one. And it's like, make sure there's no sacred cows from the legacy industry and saying like, okay, consumer electronics has actually got a bunch of stuff that needs to be kind of like moved into adjacent spaces. And there's a big opportunity for companies to do that.
Awesome. What is that last question? What is your current life philosophy?
I think part of it's like just assume good intent and like move as fast as possible. And then the other point is like there's a paranoia, but it's not a paranoia in a negative way. It's like in a like let's just boil the ocean and cover our bases kind of thing. And then if we're prepared, things will be fine. And that's my general sense across the board. And it's like, because if I go and worry about stuff, it's going to slow me down.
Sam, thanks for having me. Thanks
so much.
Thanks for the Red Bull, and thanks for building Impulse.
Thanks so much for doing this stuff.
Awesome. We did it.
Yeah, awesome.
Cool. Anything...